This time I'm going to show you how to make this handy storage pouch. It's ever so simple to make. There's no zips or buttons or fastenings or anything like that. And I think it's going to be really useful in my sewing room because there's plenty of room inside this little bag, and I can keep things like my pens and my glues and my threads, or if I'm traveling I can take everything that I need to do a little bit of hand sewing in here. It fastens over by taking the long strap through the small one, and then you're good to go. So you could hang this on the back of a door or over the back of your chair or over a door handle, and of course not just for sewing things, it could be in the bathroom or the bedroom, and what a nice gift idea that would make as well. So I've left all of the cutting requirements and your materials list in the description box underneath the video, so have a look down here, and if you don't see everything you may have to click on see more, and that'll give you all of the instructions for what you need to cut, both in imperial and in metric as well. So go have a look at your fabrics, go choose what you want to make it from, and then let's get sewing. So the first thing to do is to cut out 4 semicircle shapes from our fabric. So the way I'll do this, I'll do them individually, you could do these all together if you wish, is to fold my fabric in half, and then I'm going to take my ruler and marking pen and measure 6 inches from the folded corner. I'm just going to move that fabric over a little bit so I can make the most of it. So make sure that this line is nice and straight. I can do that a little bit more actually. I don't want to waste too much fabric. There we go. So right into the corner, and we're going to mark the 6-inch mark. I know I could have moved over a little bit more, but I'll be here all day. And then just pivot the ruler from that corner, marking 6 inches as you go. So try and keep that nice and accurate, and then we'll join all of these lines up and we'll have our semicircle right down to the edge here. I'm just going to put one more line in between those two, and then you can either draw the arc. Again, the more lines that you're going to draw on here, the more accurate you're going to be, or you can just go straight into cutting it out. And I'll need 2 of these pieces from one fabric and 2 pieces from the contrasting fabric. Then we'll also need 2 more strips of fabric measuring 17.5 inches by 4 inches. And just to remind you, all of the cutting instructions are going to be in the description box underneath the video. You may have to click on see more, but all of your materials list and what you need to cut will be there in metric and in imperial as well. Now on one piece of each of these, I'm going to put some fusible fleece onto the wrong side. So choose which configuration you want for the outside. I'm going to have my floral on the outside with the gusset in the contrast, and this is going to be in effect my lining, so I can put that to one side for now and just fuse fleece to the wrong side of this piece. So I'll just bring up my ironing mat. Now I'm using an H640, which is a Valaiseline fleece. You'll need some kind of interfacing, because if you imagine without any interfacing you're just going to have a very floppy little storage pouch. So you will need some kind of interfacing. It doesn't have to be an H630 or 40. I kind of like the thickness of this. It's thick enough to make the bag a little bit more sturdy, but it's still soft and easy to sew through. But you could, if you wanted to, just use a firm, like a woven interfacing, the kind of things you'd use for dressmaking if you prefer to. So just iron that on. Careful not to get the glue onto my, that's better, onto my iron. So I'm not ironing right up to the edge at the moment. I'll do that when I've cut these out. And finally the long strip down here. larger ironing mat would have been useful, but I only got this one in this space. And while I'm here with the iron, I've also got the thin strip of fabric, which is going to be for the handle. And this I'm going to fold in half to mark the centre point. So no fusible fleece on this one, it really doesn't need it. You could stiffen it a little bit if you wish by using a bit of spray starch or best press if your fabric needs it. But this is a nice crisp cotton, so it creases very well, which is of course what we want here. So I'm folding the long sides to the centre, and then we'll fold the whole thing in half again and just stitch it in place. There we go. Right, so let's bring in the sewing machine, and I'm just going to stitch along one side here. And then just take my little ruler and I'm going to chop a piece off the end. So let's just measure 4 inches here. That's about 10 centimetres, and just chop that off. And we'll put this to one side for just a second. But let's sew these pieces together. So I'm going to take a sharp pair of scissors, and I'm just going to make little snips along the side within the seam allowance, so really close to the edge. And this is going to help the base to sit nice and flat as we sew this around the curve. Because as this is curving, those little splits will open up like this, and it'll just make life a little bit easier as we're sewing. So not too deep. If I'm just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm just snipping about 1/8 of an inch, or about 3 millimeters into the seam allowance. And we'll need to do this on both long sides and on the same of the lining as well. Then take the long piece and one of the curved pieces, and we're going to put these right sides together, and we'll pop a pin in there just to hold that in place. I just seem to have lost my pin cushion. This long strip may be a little bit too long, and that is deliberate, because if it's too long then you can cut it down. If it's too short, you've got to cut another piece out. And depending on your seam allowance and whether you may pull the fabric slightly as you're fitting this, can kind of change the length of it a little bit, if you will. So all I'm doing is matching the straight edge up with the curved edge, and you can see how those little snips in the sides really help to bend that around the curve. Now do be careful not to stretch. You won't be able to stretch the straight bit because it's cut on the grain, but when you have something that's cut on a curve, like the semicircle underneath, part of that is going to be on the bias, which means that you have a little bit of stretch. So just be careful not to do that. So just bend this around. So take your time with this, it's important. Oops. And plenty of pins. Right back up to this end. So I'm just a little bit too long there. That's fine. And then we'll sew around the curve. And I'm using about 1/4 inch seam allowance. It doesn't matter if it's not exact. If you're a little bit more, I wouldn't go any less, as long as it's consistent. So I'm just taking the pins out as you go. Try to make sure you don't have any puckering in the seam. This is going to gather up here a little bit, but as long as you keep where the seam is flat, then you should have a nice straight stitch line. Then we're going to put in the second side. I can turn that through and just make sure that I've got a nice smooth seam on there with no gathers, which is lovely. Then we'll do the same on this side, and we're going to start from the same edge that we started on. So if this one's a little bit too long, it'll be a little bit too long on the same part of the opposite side. So again, let's marry up the edge here. So this time you're going to be sewing from the curved side. And just again, lots of pins in there, and then sew it in place. And then if you do have the end here that's a little bit longer, just trim that down so everything's the same. And then we're going to do just the same with those lining pieces. And here's a tip for you with the lining pieces. We're going to increase the seam allowance slightly. So I used 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters on the outside. So maybe add another 1/8 inch on the lining just to make it a little bit smaller. It won't make any difference to where we're going to sew the lining to the outer around the top, but it will help your lining to sit a little bit neater inside the bowl if it's only very slightly smaller. You won't be able to see that. But it will help it keep nice and flat. So again, pin all of these together in the same way as we did with the outer, and then we'll sew those together as well. So there we've got two identical pieces, one for the outside and one for the lining. Before we sew these together, we're going to put on the little straps. So let's take the short end, and we're going to place this about 1/2 inch or around about 1 centimetre from one side, and I'm just going to pop a clip in there to hold it in place, and then turn it over to the other side and clip this one at the same distance from the seam. And try and make sure that the strap isn't twisted. And then we'll do the same with the longer side here, so the same distance from the edge. Pop a clip in. And on this one, and clip, and then I'm just going to sew across the ends just to hold that in place. And then we're going to take the outer bag, which is the right side out, and pop it inside the lining, which is inside out. And I'm just going to match the seams up. So again, we can hold that with a pin. And here, so I'll just put pins in the 4 corners. I'm not going to pin all the way around this time. Make sure that the handles are facing downwards. And then we're going to sew all the way around the top, but we'll need to leave a turning gap so that we can turn this the right side out. So match up the edges as you're sewing. I'm going to just leave a turning gap in the side here of around about 3 or 4 inches or 8 to 10 centimeters. So match up the raw edges. You could use the free arm on your sewing machine if you have one. Otherwise, sew from the inside like I am here. Let's just go all the way around the top. Again, take your pins out as you sew and just marry up those seams as we go. Right, then let's turn this the right side out through the gap. So just feed it all through. Right, let's get the iron out again. And I'm just going to press this with the lining on the inside and the seam around the edge right on the edge. And where my turning gap is here, I'm just going to fold the edge of that in and press it. And then when we top stitch around the top, that's going to close the opening. Let's start with that bit here. There we go. Right, and then we're just going to cut that thread off is what I'm going to do. And then we'll top stitch all the way around the top. So again, if you've got the free arm on your sewing machine, you could use that if you find it easier. You can lengthen the stitch a little bit here as well, because it's just a top stitch. And I'm sewing about 1/4 inch, 6 millimeters away from that top edge. Still keeping the seam right on the edge. Maybe slow down a little when you come to the seams, because it is quite bulky there. You may need to ease that under the machine a little bit. Make sure that your straps are facing away from you as you come to them. This is where the opening is. So I'm just going to sew that closed and then carry on all the way around. So almost finished. What I want to do now is to just put a little crease in the center of the side. So I'm going to fold in half and I'll just hold that together with a clip. And where the fold is here, just make sure the lining's nice and flat, I'm going to sew about 3/4 inch or a couple of centimeters from the top and just reverse stitch there to make it nice and secure. And that's going to help the bag to keep its shape. So undo, go, and back. You can measure that if you wish, but basically you want about that much, just to make a little pleat in the side. Let's cut off the threads. And then we'll do the same with the other side. So match at that seam, pull that open. And again, just sew down this side by the same amount, so about 3/4 inch or a couple of centimeters. And snip off any little loose threads. Now we're almost finished. One thing that I do like to do is to just press along the seam here, just to give it a little bit of crispness. So plenty of steam, if your fabric will take it, and just crease that seam so that it's right on the edge of where I'm ironing. And that'll just help to keep its shape. And again, maybe a little bit of a spray starch or best press would work to keep that in place. There we go, and the same on the other side. So you can see I've got quite a squareness here, whereas it's still quite round here, and I like the square base. So let's fold that over. And just go around. I think we'll have a bit of spray on this one as well. There, and then we're almost finished. So that's my little bag. And to fasten, you're going to take the long strap, put it through the small one, and just pull it. and you're ready to go. I think a few of those would look quite nice actually. I have got one in different fabric here that I made before. If you're hanging them up with maybe your notions and you're sewing bits and bobs in there, could be something that you put at the back of the bathroom door and have things like your cotton wool buds or whatever you use in the bathroom and things like that. And what a nice gift idea that would make. That could be your gift packaging as well as the actual gift, couldn't it? So some little bits of makeup inside may be rather nice. So I think you'll agree it's useful. It's a lot roomier than you imagine it to be, considering how little fabric you're using, and it's quite fun to make as well. So I hope you enjoy the tutorial, and I shall see you again soon. Bye bye.